Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're picking up where we left off. We're going to be in Colossians chapter 1, verses 18 and 20. There's not that much background that I want to give you other than to remind you of what we just went over yesterday, that Paul is now reflecting on who Jesus is. And today's passage, again, just like last time's passage, is very dense. It's thick. There's a lot of stuff to define. So let me go ahead and get into that right now. The first is in verse 18, when Paul says that he is the head of the body, which is the church. That's just Paul saying that Jesus has all authority. He's in the position of leadership over the church. And in the same verse, when he says that Jesus is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, Paul is reflecting not just on the beginning of time, like in creation, but Paul is thinking about the beginning of the new creation. When Paul says that Jesus is the firstborn from the dead, he's reflecting on the fact that in God's plan to restore the world, to restore creation to himself, a big part of that agenda was to make a new creation. And Jesus was the first part of that he was the firstborn from the dead, reflects God's plan to raise everyone who believes in Jesus from the dead one day. This is a lot of big picture stuff. This is stuff called eschatology, which is the theology of the end times. But this is a really good moment for us to reflect on what God is actually doing through salvation. It's not just about you and me. It's not just about individuals going to heaven. There's a bigger plan here. So again, for Jesus to be the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, is to be the beginning of God's new creation. And the firstborn from the dead as in the first of all of us who will one day be resurrected. And now in verse 19, when Paul says that the fullness of God was pleased to dwell in Jesus, what Paul is saying is, I'm going to drop a little bit of Christology on you, okay? This is one of those classic passages that explains who exactly the Son of God is. When the Son of God came down to be born as a human, it's not that he stopped being God, but instead, as Paul says here, the fullness of God was pleased to dwell in him. This tells us that while Jesus was born fully human, he was at the same time fully God. This is one of those things that math can't really answer because 100% plus 100% equals 200%. But in this case, in the case of the Son of God becoming a human, 100% plus 100% equals 100% because there's still only one person, the person Jesus, who is both fully God and fully man. This is Christology. It's very complex. And then in verse 20, when Paul says that God wants to reconcile all things to himself through the cross, this, again, gives us a big picture focus on salvation. Salvation wasn't just about us. Jesus dying on the cross for our sake wasn't even just for our sake. But again, it's part of God's plan to restore all of creation to himself, to make everything right. So while you read this passage for yourself, let me give you a question to think about. What does this passage tell you about Jesus' role in God's redemptive plan? This is a big question. It turns our minds to think on something that we don't normally think about. And this is why this passage is so helpful for us to sit on and reflect on. So go ahead, read it on your own and take some time. And then when you're ready, come back. Welcome back. The takeaway is something I've already said in the first part of this video. And that is that this is one of those times to remember how big God's plan is and how Jesus is at the center of it. Namely, that Jesus didn't just die for our sake, but he took our place on the cross to redeem us, to reconcile us to himself, and to reconcile everyone who would believe throughout time, and ultimately to reconcile creation to God. We can think about how amazing it is that God is going to restore everything through Jesus' already finished work. That the reason why one day there's going to be no more suffering, no more sickness, no more sin, no more pain, the reason why all these bad things will be removed in God's plan is because of the one-time act that Jesus died on the cross. That is the power of the cross. It's not just to free us from sin, not just to save us from hell, but also to take care of everything that's wrong with this world. That's a big deal. And this is one of those moments for us, again, to stop and reflect on the power of Jesus and how great he is and how great the work is that he's done. And this should lead us to worship. So I hope this was helpful and a good time of reflection for you. I'll see you next time.